There are over 50 different kinds of rattlesnakes that can be found across the Americas. These snakes are some of the most extreme animals on the planet. Some of them are small enough to disappear under a single leaf, while others are thicker than my leg and longer than I am tall. Hey guys, I'm Zachary Gray, and today we're taking a full-on deep dive into the world of rattlesnakes by taking a look at and ranking every single species on Earth. From surface level knowledge and basic rattlesnake facts, to unanswered mysteries and some of the rarest rattlesnakes in the world. We're uncovering every species ever recorded, and even some that haven't been described yet. This is Every Rattlesnake on Earth Explained, the rattlesnake iceberg. Now here on the channel, we've gotten up close with a lot of different rattlesnakes. In fact, they're the group of vipers that I have the most combined experience with. And even still, I haven't even gotten to see half of the species on Earth. Before we go fully in-depth about rattlesnakes, we first have to know what a rattlesnake is. Rattlesnakes are a unique group of pit vipers, meaning they have heat-seeking pits and really large hinged fangs. And they can only be found right here in the Americas, that being North and South America. But what makes rattlesnakes unique, of course, is the rattle at the end of their tail. While it is pretty normal for snakes to rattle their tail when threatened by a large predator, only rattlesnakes have that rattle that's designed to alert larger animals, particularly mammals, when they're present. They primarily rely on camouflage to hunt by ambushing and envenomating their prey. But rattlesnakes can also be active hunters as well. They range in size, color, and habitats drastically, with there currently being two distinct types of rattlesnakes, both of which we'll cover in this video. Now with that out of the way, let's take a look at our first rattlesnakes. The western diamondback rattlesnake is probably the most well-known and most encountered rattlesnake found throughout the southwest US, down into Mexico, and as far south as Veracruz. Mostly in arid grasslands and desert habitats, but they're pretty adaptable compared to other rattlesnakes. Oddly enough, they even range as far east in the US as Arkansas, which is pretty crazy. Typically, these snakes grow between 4 and 5 feet in length, but on rare occasions, western diamondbacks have been known to reach 7 feet in length, which makes them an absolute monster of the desert. Contrary to popular belief, western diamondbacks don't have a crazy potent venom, but they have a very high venom yield. To me, the western diamondback is one of the most iconic rattlesnake species in the world. When most people imagine a rattlesnake, this is the species that they imagine. They rule their desert habitats, they're quite plentiful, and they're pretty well known in a lot of American media. I really like their patterning, and any rattlesnake that can grow over 6 feet is really cool in my book. Even though they're quite common and they aren't sporting any amazing colors, I've decided to put the western diamondback into B tier. But if the western diamondback is the Mike Tyson of rattlesnakes, this next one is Muhammad Ali.
It's a winder! Ah! That's real!
The Sidewinder is a very small, unique rattlesnake found throughout the deserts of the southwest US and into northwestern Mexico. They usually only grow to about 1.5 feet to 2 feet in length, and at a first glance they don't look too impressive. But what they're famous for is that sidewinding motion that allows them to get over really hot sand with relative ease, along with really distinguishable tracks and those horn-like scales right above their eyes. These snakes are actually fairly easy to identify. Since their venom isn't especially potent, bites usually aren't life-threatening, but their specialized movement and desert lifestyle makes them one of the most iconic rattlesnakes in the world. There are currently 3 subspecies, I believe, the Mojave, the Sonoran, and the Colorado, and out of the 3, my favorite looking ones have got to be the Colorado Sidewinders. They're fairly common in some desert regions, they're weird, and they really stand out amongst the smaller rattlesnake species. So I'm putting Sidewinders right into A tier. Now whether a rattlesnake is big or small, the thing that truly defines a rattlesnake is its rattle. Most of you probably already know how a rattlesnake rattle works, but if you don't, the rattle is just a stack of interlocking scales that are completely hollow. There's no bead inside of them. And since the scales overlap, when the rattlesnake moves its tail, it makes a loud buzzing or rattling sound. The rattle continues to form over the snake's life. Every time it sheds, a new bead is added to the end of the rattle. A lot of people think that this means you can tell the rattlesnake's age from the size of the rattle, but these rattles are actually quite brittle and they break off constantly, so it's not really great for telling the age of the snake. Now let's jump back into the snakes themselves with one of the most widespread species in the US and into Canada, the Northern Pacific rattlesnake. These very successful rattlesnakes can be found from Central California all the way up into British Columbia, usually living in coastal scrub, temperate forests, and some cooler montane habitats. I have heard of some living in the temperate rainforests from time to time, but typically they prefer those more dry, grassy habitats. On average, they grow between 3 and 4 feet long, and their coloration is either a dull greenish brown or a grayish black color. Their venom isn't as toxic as other rattlesnakes, but their bite is still capable of causing some serious damage if left untreated. And since they are so widespread in the western US, they're actually one of the deadlier snakes in the country. While they're not nearly as flashy or famous as their desert cousins, their wide range makes them one of the most encountered and ecologically important rattlesnakes in the Northwest. Sometimes they're also called western rattlesnakes. This is also correct, but for reasons I'll be ranting about later in this video, I'm going to put a pin in that for now. Since they don't have many other unique traits or colors, I'm putting them into C tier. But I absolutely love these snakes. I think the habitat that they use is really cool, and they're a perfect example of a widespread, medically significant rattlesnake that's oftentimes encountered by people. Which begs the question, how dangerous are rattlesnakes actually? Currently, we believe across North, Central, and South America, an estimated 10 to 15,000 people a year are bitten by rattlesnakes. But it's really hard to tell, being as most of the bites happen in very rural or underreported areas. Despite that, deaths from rattlesnakes are pretty rare, especially in the US, where we know that fewer than 6 people die every single year from snake envenomations. Thanks to modern medical treatment and antivenom, most rattlesnake bites are fairly treatable. However, that doesn't mean you should ever take them lightly. And the best way to stay safe is to respect these animals and give them plenty of space. Most snake bites happen when people are trying to kill or move a rattlesnake, so that's not a good idea, especially for this next snake on our list. The tiger rattlesnake is one of the most toxic rattlesnake species. Despite only reaching about 2 to 3 feet in length, their venom packs a punch. In fact, in some lab studies, their LD50 or lethal dosage is some of the lowest seen in any rattlesnake species. Fortunately, bites are incredibly rare, as tiger rattlesnakes have a very small home range between southern Arizona and North Mexico. They tend to hang around canyons and washes, hiding in very rocky areas with lots of underground access. So they aren't encountered by people nearly as much as the other rattlesnakes in the region. But they are also occasionally found in more open deserts. While they aren't super flashy, tiger rattlesnakes are pretty cool. They also have a really tiny head for the size of their body, which looks really funny. They're a solid B tier snake. Despite their incredibly toxic venom, there's actually never been a recorded death from one of these snakes, unlike this next rattlesnake. The eastern diamondback rattlesnake is the largest rattlesnake species in the world, and it absolutely lives up to the hype. Found across the southeast US, mostly in longleaf pine savannas, coastal scrub, and sand hills, the eastern diamondback rattlesnake is capable of growing over 6 feet in length, with the world record individual measuring at 7.9 feet in length, almost 8 feet long, and weighing over 30 pounds. This is a once-in-a-lifetime monster snake. Even seeing one over 6 feet nowadays is incredibly rare, 6.5 feet even rarer, and over 7 feet, unbelievably rare. These snakes are absolute tanks, and in my opinion, they're one of the most athletic and intimidating rattlesnakes you can encounter. Their venom is quite toxic, but what makes them so deadly to people is their massive venom yield. They have the highest venom yield of any rattlesnake species. And by many, including myself, they're considered to be the deadliest snake in the US. In my opinion, they look a lot cooler than the western diamondbacks, usually sporting a greenish sage coloration with those black outlines around their diamonds. And it doesn't look like it, but this pattern actually allows them to be incredibly camouflaged, especially amongst really tall grasses. Despite being such a legendary snake, they're becoming harder to find in the wild due to habitat loss and persecution, with most of them unfortunately being killed on sight by anybody that sees them. In fact, when Steve Irwin came to the US in the early 2000s, he actually complained that these guys weren't on the endangered species list because they spent so long looking for them and didn't find any at first. And that was over 20 years ago now. So these animals are definitely in need of some managed and upgraded habitat. Eastern diamondback rattlesnakes are the rattlesnake. They are the total package. They are my favorite species, and there are many others as well. So these guys go straight into S tier. They're also my personally second most researched rattlesnake species, both from a field and reading standpoint. I've actually been going through this book right here by Bruce Means, and it has a lot of really cool rattlesnake observations dating back as far as the 1970s. So they have a very special place in my heart and a very special place in the southeast US. But all of these snakes are just the tip of the iceberg to what rattlesnakes have to offer. The snakes you've probably heard about before in one way or another. But now we're stepping just beneath the surface, where these snakes become a lot more specialized. One of the most notable traits of rattlesnakes, obviously, is their venom. They're an incredibly feared and respected snake throughout their range. And for good reason, their bites can absolutely kill you. But some rattlesnakes don't just have one type of venom. Usually, pit viper venom is mostly comprised of what's called hemotoxins, or toxins that affect the blood. But depending on what species and where they live, some rattlesnakes can produce totally different venom types, with mixes of cytotoxins, myotoxins, neurotoxins, and even crotoxins, and honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if there's more to come. The Mojave rattlesnake is the most famous example of this. Often considered the most venomous rattlesnake in the world, Mojaves can be found across the deserts of the southwest into northern Mexico. And for all intents and purposes, they look pretty similar to the western diamondback. But their venom is many times more potent. In fact, Mojaves are just one of a handful of rattlesnake species known to possess neurotoxic venom, which affects the nervous system, potentially causing paralysis and respiratory failure that can oftentimes lead to death. What's wild is that not all Mojaves have this same venom type. Some have neurotoxic dominant venoms, especially those in central Arizona and California, called type A venom, while others have a mostly hemotoxic venom, usually called type B. Areas where they overlap, this is known as type AB venom. Usually they're around 3 or 4 feet on average, and as I mentioned, they can have a very similar coloration to the western diamondback. One of the common ID tips that usually works to tell these two apart is the tail colors, since Mojaves have mostly white compared to the western diamondback's half black, half white tail. But that is by no means foolproof, and there's a lot of little ways to tell the difference between a Mojave and a western diamondback. At a first glance, Mojaves don't seem all that unique. Sure, they have an incredibly toxic venom, but they're not super rare and they don't seem to be super specialized. That is until you hop across the southern border straight into Mexico and take a look at the Hamontland rattlesnake. This is one of the coolest looking rattlesnakes I have ever seen. This red Mojave subspecies is found at the southernmost end of the Mojave's range into Mexico, in just a couple of arid grasslands and the foothills of the Sierra Madre Oriental. Even the ones with duller colors in this region are just awesome. To me, Mojaves are already a really cool and iconic snake, but the Hamontlands really bring it up a notch. And for that reason, they're going straight into S tier. But having multiple venom types isn't just a Mojave thing. The southern Pacific rattlesnake can have hemotoxic, neurotoxic, and myotoxic venom. This species ranges across Southern California and into the Baja Peninsula, and it has some insanely toxic venom, much more toxic than its northern counterpart. They usually grow anywhere between 3 and 4 feet long, and they range in color from a dusty brown to an olive green coloration, which helps them blend in perfectly to the coastal scrubs that they call home. In my opinion, the thing that makes these snakes the most notorious is their geography. Their presence right around Los Angeles and the San Diego regions means that a lot of people are passing through their preferred coastal habitats going to the beach. While they aren't flashy by any means, I would say that Southern Pacifics are a pretty respectable rattlesnake, and they're high on the list of snakes to keep an eye out for if you're ever in their range. Overall, I think they're pretty cool, so I'm putting them into B tier. And up next, we have a group of snakes that I'm sure that many of you are familiar with, and that's the Pygmy rattlesnakes. You see, rattlesnakes are split into 2 distinct groups: the larger, more traditional rattlesnakes, and the Massasaugas, or the Pygmies, what I like to call the mini rattlesnakes. One of the strangest things about the mini rattlesnakes is their rattle. It is comically small, and oftentimes you can barely hear it even if they're rattling as hard as they can. Because of their massive range and excellent camouflage, these snakes are responsible for a lot of bites here in the US. But since they have such a low venom yield and typically a low toxicity, their bites aren't usually fatal unless you have an allergic reaction. The dusky Pygmy rattlesnakes in Florida are the ones that most people are familiar with, being found pretty commonly in almost any habitat across the state. Western Pygmy rattlesnakes, the ones found in my home state of Louisiana and westward, look pretty similar to Duskies with a lighter color, and they're a bit less common due to habitat loss. But the Carolina Pygmy rattlesnakes are absolute stunners. They can be light gray to lavender, but most notably, they can be bright red. Since these are all technically the same species, they have similar size, venom, and behavior, but based on appearance, range, and how interesting they are to see, I'll be ranking them a little bit differently. The dusky Pygmy rattlesnake is going into D tier, since they aren't as colorful, and they're probably the most common rattlesnake to see. The western Pygmy rattlesnakes I'm putting into C tier. I give them a slight edge here because they are less common, and they usually are a bit prettier. They also grow to be some of the larger of the Pygmy rattlesnakes. And the Carolina Pygmy gets A tier. They just look unreal, they're super rare, And I think they're one of the most photogenic rattlesnakes here in the US. And it's because of their coloration that these animals face a lot of pressure from poachers. So they overall are in decline. Some of my favorite snakes in the US, the Carolinas, are just awesome. Up next are the Massasaugas, and unlike our previous pygmy rattlesnakes, these mini rattlesnakes have a decently toxic venom, even compared to some traditional rattlesnakes. Massasaugas are scattered in pockets all across the US and southern Canada, with the eastern stronghold being right around the Great Lakes region, and the western Massasaugas living out in the Midwest and the Southwest US. Despite having a more respectable venom, bites are still pretty rare due to their shy nature and their overall declining populations. Also amongst the western Massasaugas, there are two distinct subspecies, the plains and desert Massasaugas. Plains Massasaugas are more widespread, they tend to be a bit larger, they usually live in grasslands, whereas the deserts are much more confined, and as their name suggests, live in deserts. They're one of those rattlesnakes that would be special just to see, and they're very hard to find if you're not looking for them. Massasaugas might not seem too impressive at a first glance, but their rarity and respectable venom puts them into B tier. Now hopping back to our full-size rattlesnakes, we have the red diamondback. These snakes can be found throughout South California down into Mexico's Baja Peninsula, mostly in deserts and rocky hillsides, where their lighter colors can help them blend into sandstone found along cliffs and washes. They look pretty similar to western diamondbacks overall, but they don't get as big, and as their name suggests, they have a more reddish coloration. Now venom-wise, they actually have a very low venom toxicity compared to their close relatives, but they still have a pretty high venom yield, which means their bites are still pretty respectable. So while they're not the biggest, flashiest, or most notorious rattlesnake out there, they're still an impressive species with a limited range and some awesome colorations. So I've decided to put them in B tier, right alongside their western counterparts. And keeping it along the Baja Peninsula, we have the Baja rattlesnake, or as I like to call them, the I eat everything that moves rattlesnake. At a first glance, Bajas look like just another nondescript desert rattlesnake. They have a really narrow head, big eyes, and a smaller body. They're found pretty commonly along the Baja Peninsula, with 3 subspecies currently recognized, including one island variant and one dusky variant. What's unique about these snakes is when they're in ambush, everything is fair game. While most rattlesnakes eat small lizards as juveniles, and then they tend to transition into eating small mammals as adults, the Baja rattlesnake will eat just about anything at any stage in life. This includes small lizards, mammals, birds, and giant centipedes. Since this region is so harsh, I'd imagine that this is their way of competing with the other snakes in the region for food. But even still, a rattlesnake that eats giant desert centipedes is just wild to me. They definitely don't look like much, but they're a pretty hardcore rattlesnake, so they're going into C tier. And another Mexican rattlesnake species that I'm sure many of you aren't familiar with is the Mexican lancehead rattlesnake. They're called lanceheads because a lot of people thought they looked pretty similar to the lancehead vipers found on the other side of the Sierra Madre Oriental Mountains. Lancehead rattlesnakes are pretty small, only getting a few feet in length, and they have this really cool spotted, almost leopard patterning. They mostly live in arid grasslands around the Mexican plateau, where they can be seen anywhere between 4,000 and 8,000 feet in elevation. They're a gorgeous snake species, and even though there isn't a ton to know about their venom, the bites that we do know about were pretty manageable with medical treatment. I'm throwing these guys into B tier because they look really cool, and we still have a lot to learn about them. And now, jumping back over to the US, we have the Arizona black rattlesnake. These snakes are mostly found up in high elevation forests and canyons in central and east Arizona, sometimes creeping into New Mexico. They tend to be on the smaller side, ranging from 3 to 4 feet max, and the adults are usually a dark charcoal gray or black coloration. In my opinion, the most unique aspect of these rattlesnakes is their ability to change colors when disturbed. While they're not the only snake capable of changing their colors, there are some of the first known rattlesnakes with this ability, although something tells me that more will be discovered within my lifetime. I remember the first one that I saw last year was probably one of my favorite rattlesnake encounters, and after talking with local experts, I've definitely gained a newfound appreciation for these snakes. I also really like the ones with those deep black colorations. They just look sick. I really wanted to put these snakes into S tier, but compared to some of the other snakes that we have on our list, they just don't make the cut, so they're sitting right at the top of A tier. Now jumping back down to the lowland deserts, we have the Panamint rattlesnake, a snake native to the eastern parts of California and the western and northwestern portions of Nevada and Arizona. These rattlesnakes are found in some of the harshest environments in the US, including the rocky slopes of Death Valley, the hottest place on Earth. Usually found between 3,000 and 7,000 feet in elevation, Panamint rattlesnakes are adept at living in very bare environments that even other rattlesnakes usually consider to be inhospitable. And they've got some really cool colors, so they're going into C tier. You'll definitely notice that a lot of these snakes are found in the southwest US and northern Mexico, and there's definitely a good reason for that. Rattlesnakes are very adept to those rocky, bare habitats where they really don't have as much competition from other viper species. Still though, that'll change as we go further down this list. Also want to give a quick shout out to Rattlesnake Solutions. They're a company that works right out of Arizona, and they have lots of public information on these snakes. They do tons of rattlesnake relocations. So if you ever find yourself living in the hot deserts of the Southwest and you have rattlesnake conflicts, they're a great resource to look into to keep yourself safe. Now leaving the deserts of the US back down into Mexico is one of their most impressive rattlesnakes, the Basilisk rattlesnake. Also sometimes called a Mexican green or a cantil rattlesnake. These guys are some of the largest snakes in Mexico, with adults growing as large as 6 feet, sometimes closing in on 7 feet in length. They usually carry that classic diamondback patterning, but what really sets them apart is their color. While the younger snakes have some really odd colorations, the adults usually have this olive or green coloration that helps them blend into the scrublands along the Mexican Pacific coast. And it's not just their size that's impressive, but also their venom, and they have a lot of it. Thankfully though, they're not an overly aggressive snake, and most of the time they'd much prefer to slip out of your way without being seen. Still though, it's not a rattlesnake you'd want to ever step on or mess with. I'd imagine they're mostly eating a lot of rock squirrels and large rabbits due to their size. But being such a large rattlesnake that primarily lives on the Sierra Madre Occidental Mountains on the Pacific coast, it wouldn't surprise me that every so often they'd go after larger prey like a young coati or even a ringtail. In a lot of ways, they remind me of the Pacific rattlesnakes of the US, mixed with the tropical rattlesnakes that we'll be talking more about later. I would say they belong at the bottom of S tier. They aren't particularly flashy compared to some of the other snakes on our list, but to me, they are a top tier rattlesnake. As we look deeper into rattlesnake biology, you're going to notice all this variation, all these unique characteristics that many snakes don't have. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, rattlesnakes seem to be a bit smarter than your average snake. And it's because of this they show a lot of unique behaviors. Things like male combat, parental care of young, and most notably, denning. Historically, rattlesnakes were known to group up in hundreds or even thousands, spending their winters brumating in large underground dens. And while many rattlesnakes still do this, the largest dens, unfortunately, have been destroyed. And the rattlesnake that most often comes up when you talk about denning is the prairie rattlesnake. These snakes are found across a huge swath of North America, found in southern Canada and North Mexico. While they look pretty standard in terms of pattern and color, they're probably one of the best examples of a communally denning rattlesnake where their numbers are incredibly high. Every winter, dozens or even hundreds of these snakes can gather in the same underground hibernaculums, often returning to the same ones year after year. Since these snakes can live in a wide variety of regions, they're fairly common, so many of these dens actually still do exist, just not to the extent that they did historically. Prairie rattlesnakes do have a decently potent venom, but they have a small venom yield, which means they're not nearly as deadly as many of the other western species. Since these snakes are so common, they don't sport any colors, and besides their denning in high numbers, they don't have any outstanding characteristics. They're probably one of the more basic rattlesnake species in my opinion. And so for now, the prairie rattlesnake sits in D tier. And while I'm on the topic of unique behaviors, there's another behavior that prairie rattlesnakes, as well as many other rattlesnakes, have begun to exhibit, and that is the lack of rattling when disturbed. Some rattlesnakes that live in heavily trafficked or more urban areas seem to not rattle as much as their more undisturbed counterparts. I will say this is a controversial topic. I don't feel like this is 100% accurate, and there's a little bit of bias coming from the people that are observing this. Rattlesnakes don't oftentimes rattle when they're approached, only when they feel threatened. But it is something to note, rattlesnakes do rattle when they're approached, and we're starting to see that some of them just won't. Obviously, there's a lot of different rattlesnakes and a lot of different behaviors. And before I get to our next species, I have a little mini rant to go on about rattlesnake complexes. A species complex is basically a group of animals that look so similar to each other that it's hard to tell where one species stops and another one begins. And what that means for us is identifying rattlesnakes can get really, really difficult. and sometimes it can be hard to say whether you're looking at a totally different species at all. And this rings very true for the western rattlesnake complex, which includes rattlesnakes that we've already discussed, like the northern and southern Pacific rattlesnake. Some people lump them all together and say that they're virtually the same snakes, while others say that they're entirely different species. The key thing to understand is that many of these snakes can be hard to distinguish when put side by side, but they aren't oftentimes side by side in nature, so we tend to call them different things because of certain attributes and geography. But for the purposes of this video, I feel like it's in our best interest to look at each individual western rattlesnake. The Great Basin rattlesnake is a high desert representative of the western rattlesnake, usually living in really open habitats like sagebrush flats or more rocky hillsides. Color-wise, they tend to have a more washed-out appearance than their coastal relatives, and their bites are still pretty serious. Another lesser-known variation of these guys, the Grand Canyon rattlesnake, as their name suggests, can only be found living in the Grand Canyon region, and they tend to have a more sandstone coloration to match the environment. I'm putting the Great Basin and the Grand Canyon rattlesnake both into C tier. They're tough as nails, but their venom isn't too unique, and they're not the most charismatic rattlesnakes out there. Still though, for anyone hoping to see all the Southwest rattlesnakes, these guys are a treat. And for our final member of the western rattlesnake complex, we have the midget faded rattlesnake. Found mostly in the state of Utah and some western Colorado and South Wyoming, these rattlesnakes sport an incredibly toxic venom some would consider to be as potent as the tiger and Mojave rattlesnakes. However, they're an incredibly small and timid rattlesnake, so bites from these guys are few and far between, and there's never actually been a recorded death from one of these snakes. A lot of times they tend to have a more plain tan coloration, but they can sometimes be a more pinkish color to match the sandstone outcrops found along the Colorado and Green River basins, which is really the only places you're going to see these guys. As juveniles, they're almost indistinguishable from any other snake in the western complex, but as they grow, they become a little bit easier to identify. I really like these snakes. They have a super toxic venom. They don't look like much, but they're a pretty understudied group, so for now, I'm going to put them into C tier. Although I could see these snakes being placed a little bit higher. I've never actually encountered one myself, so they might be a little bit cooler than I think. Now it's time to talk about one of my favorite rattlesnake groups, the Blacktails. These rugged Southwest rattlesnakes are oftentimes really overlooked, but they're some of my favorites due to their really placid dispositions. Western blacktails can be found across Arizona, New Mexico, and central Mexico, usually hanging around rock canyons, desert foothills, and some montane woodlands as you get up into the Sky Islands. There are currently a few subspecies of the western blacktail that, in my opinion, could very well be whole new species, but we're not exactly sure at this time. Likewise, the eastern blacktail is mostly found in the Trans-Pecos region down into northern Mexico. They typically grow between 3 and 5 feet in length and have a more mild hemotoxic venom. In my personal experience with rattlesnakes, these are some of the most placid, relying on their camouflage to avoid people and their ability to climb trees. They kind of remind me of the rattlesnakes I work with in South Louisiana, but they're also not as heavy-bodied as the ones we have here. But besides that, they don't have many outstanding features, so I'm putting them into C tier. And hopping back over the southern border, we have the Mexican pygmy rattlesnake. Unlike the American pygmies, these are actually just a smaller species of typical rattlesnake, so they're not actually related to ours, and they are considered a full-size rattlesnake. This species lives high in the montane forests of central Mexico, and little is known about their venom or bite, and there aren't a lot of public cases of snake bites due to being found more in rural areas. I did find a couple of bite cases, and from the looks of it, it seems like they're a more mild venomous species. Their coloration helps them blend more into montane forest habitats, where they hunt for lizards and small mammals. They're a species that seems to be fairly successful in the Mexican plateau, and they are actually a part of a very large complex that we'll be talking more about later. But I figured since they're a more commonly encountered snake in central Mexico, some of you might already be familiar with them. I'd say they're a solid B-tier snake. They're not overly flashy, but they have a really cool coloration, and we still have a lot to learn about these guys. Now bouncing back to the US, we have the speckled and Southwest speckled rattlesnakes. These snakes are camouflage specialists, with colors designed to match the rock ledges and cuts they call home. And since they have a decently wide range, they come in a lot of different colors. Reds, pinks, oranges, even blues. The Southwest specs tend to be more colorful because of all the unique habitats that they live in, whereas the regular specs tend to have more brown, tan, or orangish coloration, but they can vary a good bit too. Besides their color, they're a pretty typical rattlesnake overall. They feed on little lizards and skinks as juveniles, and lean more towards small mammals and birds as they get older, with some colorations actually specializing in catching birds. They also sometimes look like a tiger rattlesnake with a really big head, but their venom is not nearly as toxic. Still, I definitely wouldn't want to get tagged by one. These two rattlesnakes are in a complex, along with Panamint rattlesnakes and some island species. They're some of my favorite looking in the Southwest, and my two favorite colorations has got to be the granite white specks and the lava rock black specks. The black and white specks are just insane. The adaptation and variation of the Southwest speckled rattlesnake makes them one of my favorites personally, and the regular specks live in the most extreme habitats around. So I'm going to put the Southwest into A tier and the speckleds into B tier. Now, as we begin to look at rattlesnakes as a whole, we're getting past a lot of the snakes that people would randomly encounter. Many rattlesnakes actually live in very remote, difficult to access regions, and are usually only encountered by people wanting to find them. The montane rattlesnakes of the Southwest US and Mexico are particularly not only difficult to find, but also to spot. Not only do we have a lot of learning to do about these rattlesnakes, but we're also at risk of losing some of them in the wild due to poaching. The most common montane rattlesnake species are most certainly the rock rattlesnakes. As their name suggests, they pretty much look like a small rock, sporting lots of grays, browns, and are typically no bigger than 1.5 feet in length. They mostly feed on small lizards, although they will eat small mammals, and they don't have a very potent venom. However, I do know quite a few people that have been tagged by rock rattlesnakes, and they have all told me that it is an incredibly painful bite, not one that any of them would recommend, usually requiring some level of medical intervention. There are 3 subspecies of rock rattlesnake: the banded, the mottled, and the Durangos, with the other rock rattlesnakes being whole new species on their own. Personally, I think the Durangos are some of the coolest looking in this group, but each of these rattlesnakes is probably somebody's favorite. And one thing I'd like to point out, this small rock-like drab rattlesnake build is going to become very common as we move forward in this video. Many of the montane rattlesnakes are somewhat related, and because of that, they're going to have a lot of similarities. While many of them are ecologically and geographically distinct, they don't have too many outstanding features like the other rattlesnakes on this list. So for the sake of this video, I've decided to call them the Little Dark Rock Rattlers, otherwise known as LDRs. Personally, I really love rock rattlesnakes. I've spent a good deal of time in their habitat out west, and that's probably my favorite aspect of these animals, the incredible habitat that they live in. It's really gorgeous, and it's always a treat to see. Now, this may be contrary to popular opinion, but I'm putting these guys into C tier, since they're not as unique as some of the other montane rattlesnakes, like this next one. The ridge-nosed rattlesnakes are Sky Island specialists, living in extreme southwest US and northern Mexico in very high elevation woodland habitats. While these snakes oftentimes share habitat with the rock rattlesnakes, ridge-nosed rattlesnakes are much rarer, and are usually only encountered by biologists or people specifically hoping to find them. They're pretty distinct, having that upturned nose and blotch brown coloration. They're essentially a woodland rock rattlesnake. But depending on the subspecies, of which there are 5, their facial patterns can look like an entirely different snake. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if over the next decade or so, some people pitched that they're totally different species. One of these ridge noses, the New Mexican ridge nose, is actually an endangered species here in the US. So these snakes are at risk in the wild, and they are in decline due to poaching and some habitat loss. But there are some really great organizations and some really cool people doing work with these snakes, which is pretty cool. While they aren't highly venomous, large, or even well known, they're actually Arizona's state reptile, and in my opinion, one of the cooler montane rattlesnakes. So I put these guys solidly in A tier. And finally, our last of the American montane rattlesnakes, we have the twin-spotted. These LDRs are something of a mythical snake for a lot of die-hard snake hunters. And they're some of the most extreme montane rattlesnakes in the US, living on rocky mountain outcrops and elevations as high as 10,000 feet, far above where the ridge noses and rocks tend to be. Now, because of this, they're an incredibly small rattlesnake species, and they live in very precarious rock ledges. Like, they are just straight up dangerous for anyone to go to. We think they're a reptile specialist overall, mostly eating small lizards, but we actually don't know that much about them since they're so rare, and their populations tend to be quite pocketed. We also have 0 recorded bite or venom data from these snakes. We believe that their venom is pretty mild, similar to other LDRs, but I certainly don't want to be the first person to find out. There are two subspecies of these snakes, the eastern twin-spotted and the western twin-spotted, and while they don't look all that different, they inhabit entirely different sky islands. Their extreme montane specialization and mysterious lifestyle puts these guys solidly into B tier for me. They're certainly a gem of the montane habitats, and it takes a lot of work to see one of these animals in the wild. Still though, if you love seeing rattlesnakes and you've ever looked for them, this one is sort of a mythical species. And speaking of myths and legends, rattlesnakes have been at the center of many over the course of human history. From the Aztecs' feathered serpents, which appear to be a large, dragon-like depiction of a rattlesnake, and in more modern times in the Appalachian Mountains, there are actually still religious ceremonies held using rattlesnakes. These rattlesnake churches believe that handling venomous snakes is a showcase of great faith. If you ask me, handling any rattlesnake is a bad idea. And at the center of this ceremony is the timber rattlesnake. Being the most prominent rattlesnake in the eastern United States, the timber rattlesnake, also colloquially called the canebrake rattlesnake in the South, is one of the most prolific and notorious rattlesnakes in American history. Described by Carl Linnaeus in 1758, and being the rattlesnake found in most of the original colonies, you'll see them in a lot of early American works, most notably and famously the Gadsden flag, which is still a pretty popular political piece to this day. They were also Ben Franklin's favorite animal. In fact, he wanted them to be a symbol of the US. But as you can imagine, that wasn't a very popular idea. Most people did not like these animals. And honestly, probably still don't. I could talk about timber rattlesnakes all day long. They are the species that I have the most combined experience with. They live in so many different habitats throughout the eastern US. They have multiple different venom types, and they grow to be quite large. Because they're so widespread, they display a lot of unique behaviors. I've seen them sitting up in trees, I've seen them under abandoned buildings, and one of my favorite rattlesnake sightings ever was actually with this species last year. You see, we actually had a crazy snowstorm last year in Louisiana, and sure enough, I got to see this rattlesnake huddled up under cover in the snow, and out not even a week later after the snow had melted. These rattlesnakes are much more cold tolerant than their relatives, but even still, this is the only public photos or video of a rattlesnake in the snow. If it isn't obvious, I absolutely love these snakes. They're an American icon, and they're the ones that I've spent the most time researching. So obviously, I'm going to put the timber rattlesnake right up there in S tier. I could genuinely make this whole video about timber rattlesnakes. They're just incredible. But now it's time that we permanently leave the US for the sake of this video, because we have covered every single species that we have. In fact, the place with the greatest density of rattlesnakes in the world is actually Mexico. From lowland deserts and montane pine forests to more tropical areas, Mexico is home to over 40 rattlesnake species, making up 70% of all known rattlesnakes. One of the more generalist Mexican rattlesnakes that you're likely to encounter if you ever visit Mexico City is the dusky rattlesnake. These LDRs get about 2 feet in length, and much like their rock and twin-spotted cousins to the north, have a pretty typical blotched patterning with those gray and tan colorations that make them look just like a rock. This really helps them blend into a multitude of different habitats throughout the Mexican plateau, including montane pine oak and grassland habitats. On top of having varied habitat, they also have a varied diet, eating just about anything that's smaller than them. Mice, lizards, small insects, frogs, and even salamanders, which is pretty bizarre, especially for a rattlesnake. There are currently 2 subspecies of the dusky rattlesnake, and they are most certainly one of the most common rattlesnakes in the region. On top of the regular duskies, there are 2 more species of these little LDRs, and I apologize if I butcher these pronunciations. We're definitely going to do that a lot this video. The Queratan dusky, which can be found a bit more north and around the base of the Sierra Madre Oriental Mountains, and the Mexican dusky, which can be found more west. They each inhabit a different mountain region, and they sport their own unique color sets, with the Queratan duskies being highly variable, and the Mexican duskies sometimes sporting this really nice orange coloration. All 3 of these species have a really mild venom, and while I couldn't find a lot of bite records, they're most likely comparable to other rock rattlesnake species. Definitely not a snake that you'd want to get bit by, but most likely not deadly. Overall, they're pretty nondescript, and while I did find some absolutely gorgeous pictures of some of these snakes, they're a fairly typical LDR group. So all 3 species are going into C tier. And up next, we have what is one of the most complex rattlesnake species in the world, the Tamaulipan rock rattlesnake. Unlike their LDR cousins, these snakes, found in the northeast of the Sierra Madre Oriental Mountains, have some of the most varied colorations of any rattlesnake species. I would say their variation is comparable to speckled rattlesnakes in many places, but they'll even have totally different colors all in the same place, ranging from a typical gray and orange to pinks, blues, reds, blotches, specks, stripes. These snakes can be virtually any color and any pattern you can think of. I've always nicknamed the Tamaulipan rocks the variable rattlesnake. One, because they're variable, but two, they actually share a range with the variable king snake. But since these snakes have so many different colorations, the variable king snakes just look absolutely nuts, and they have so many different variants. That makes this region an absolute hodgepodge of uniquely colored animals, all trying to keep up with each other's colorations without a clear or consistent coloration goal. Not only are their colors unique, but their venom is specialized for invertebrates. That's right, this rattlesnake mostly just eats bugs. They mostly feed on small insects, but sometimes they'll go for a scorpion or a small centipede. This unique venom type has them currently being researched for many medical applications, including some new cancer treatments. Since their venom isn't crazy toxic, it's really interesting to think that their venom might end up saving more lives than any rattlesnake has ever taken. The specialized venom, unique colors, and the interesting lifestyle of these snakes makes them one of the more exciting montane species that we've talked about. So for that reason, I'm sticking the Tamaulipan rocks straight into A tier. And on the flip side of one of Mexico's most unique and variable snakes, we have more LDRs. There are so many little brown, dark-colored snakes in this region, it's not even funny. But clearly, this is what peak rattlesnake performance looks like. The Mexican small-headed rattlesnake can be found throughout central South Mexico in dry pine oak habitats, and some of them even go into the cloud forests and lowland desert regions. There are at least 3 subspecies of small-headed rattlesnake, and their most notable feature is being found at incredibly high elevations, sometimes as high as 13,000 feet. That is definitely the highest elevation rattlesnake that we have covered so far. As its name suggests, it has a very small head, and aside from that, we don't know that much more about these rattlesnakes. That, or there just isn't that much more to know. If there is, y'all are certainly going to have to tell me. I tried to find more information on these guys, but overall, they're a very basic rattlesnake. C tier. Actually, nah, I'm only saying that because I haven't seen them before. Small heads, they might be kind of rare and specialized, but they're not interesting as far as the overall rattlesnake comparison, so we're throwing them into D tier with prairies. Sorry, small heads. Now, as we head further south, we end up in a whole new world of tropical and arid environments, filled with some of the deadliest snakes in the Western Hemisphere. Bushmasters, fertile ants, and of course, rattlesnakes. The tropical rattlesnakes found throughout Central and South America are likely to be some of the deadliest rattlesnakes in the world, due to their unique venom cocktails containing neurotoxins, myotoxins, and unique to only this group, crotoxin, which can kill you in so many different ways. Respiratory failure, renal failure, paralysis, heart failure. There are so many different ways that you can die from the bite from these rattlesnakes. A good bite from any of these snakes is likely to be fatal, and even people that recover from the bites are oftentimes permanently disfigured. The South American rattlesnake, also called the tropical rattlesnake, is a very large neotropical species that's normally distinguished by having 2 stripes on its neck, down to these blotched diamond patterns down the back, and they're usually sporting a more olive green or tan coloration. It can be found living in tropical savannas, arid grasslands, and some deciduous forests. So overall, they're a fairly adaptable snake. On average, they grow between 4 and 5 feet in length, but on exceedingly rare occasions, they are capable of growing over 6 feet in length, so they are a beefy rattlesnake. There are currently 7 subspecies of the tropical rattlesnake, many of which we know very little about. But my favorite of these is probably the Rupununi rattlesnake, which is endemic to southwest Guyana's grasslands. There's also the Mount Roraima rattlesnake, which out of the 7 has the highest rate of crotoxin. This high concentration of crotoxin actually makes it to where treating the bite with lancehead antivenom is more effective than using typical rattlesnake antivenom. Probably one of my favorite facts about these guys, but other than that, we don't know that much about them. Overall, these are an insane rattlesnake, and while I do think there's a lot more to be discovered about these species that we'll get more into later, what we do know is that they're some of the gnarliest rattlesnakes in the world. Easily makes A tier. But the neotropical rattlesnakes are not just isolated to South America. Some of the more distinct species in the complex are a bit further north. The Central American rattlesnake, while not as big as its South American counterparts and not nearly as toxic, inhabits drier regions between southern Mexico all the way down into Costa Rica. While they don't seem to inhabit any regions in Panama, there have been records of them in Colombia. So clearly at some point they have crossed over that region. Funny enough, the adults of this species don't have any crotoxins in their venom, but rather the juveniles do, as their composition shifts as they get older. Discoveries like this lead a lot of people to believe that baby venomous snakes are more potent than the adults, but this is actually more of the exception rather than the rule. There's plenty of snakes where the juveniles are less toxic than the adults, so this is really a species by species thing, but in this case, the babies have the more deadly crotoxin. Often compared to and confused with the lancehead vipers in the region, these are a very large and very intimidating venomous snake. And while their venom isn't nearly as toxic as others, their bites oftentimes lead to amputations. A bit north between Guatemala and Oaxaca, we find another large tropical rattlesnake, the Tehuantepec Isthmus neotropical rattlesnake. Unlike their arid grassland counterparts, these snakes actually do inhabit some of the tropical deciduous rainforests. While they do seem to prefer those rocky clearings and outcrops in these sections, they are a much more jungle-adept rattlesnake. Also, their scientific name, Eekat, comes from the word meaning Lord of the Wind, and is a reference to an old Aztec deity. Little is known about their venom, but rest assured you do not have to go find out. It is a neotropical rattlesnake. This thing is most likely very deadly. And a bit north of them, we have the Yucatan rattlesnake. Found only on the Yucatan Peninsula, these are a tropical rattlesnake that most often encounters tourists visiting the region. And as such, they run into a whole stack of conflicts with people. They also seem to be a little bit less variable than the other tropical rattlesnakes, usually sporting a kind of sage greenish coloration, and their patterns are fairly consistent. Their venom composition and changes are very similar to the Isthmus neotropical, since they do lose those neurotoxic and crotoxic venoms for more hemotoxin as they get older. And this is a common trend for these rattlesnakes. As their diet shifts from lizards to small mammals, hemotoxins become preferable. Described back in 2005, these are most certainly a notorious tropical species. But if you think 2005 is recent, the Veracruz rattlesnake was only just described in 2020. Not only are they less notorious, but they're probably the rarest neotropical rattlesnake currently found in Central America. They mostly inhabit dry, deciduous forests along the Veracruz Gulf Coast. And since they were described so recently, we still have a lot to learn about these guys. Their scientific name also comes from the Aztec god of the underworld. It does seem to be a pattern to name some of the coolest rattlesnakes after old deities, especially in Central America, where people have been interacting with these snakes for many millennia now. And it just goes to show you that even though most people don't like rattlesnakes, there is certainly a respect for these animals throughout history. And as we move north back into Mexico, these last two tropical rattlesnakes are probably the most majestic. The Northwest neotropical rattlesnake is another rattlesnake to watch out for right south of Mexico City, where it ranges across the Central Plateau and the Sierra Madre del Sur. They live in a wide range of habitats: tropical deciduous forests, scrublands, arid grasslands, mesic forests, Pacific coastlines. Just as long as they have a nice rocky outcrop to live in that has a bunch of burrows, they're pretty happy with just about anything. These snakes have a really bulky build, with a lot of muscles on their jaw and back, which makes them a pretty intimidating and athletic snake. Kind of a tropical version of a basilisk or an eastern diamondback, but their face looks kind of like a bushmaster. Granted, these snakes aren't as venomous as their southern counterparts, but they have a high venom yield, so they are deadly. And lastly, we have one of my favorites, the Tanakan rattlesnake. Living right smack in the southern Tamaulipas, just south of Texas, these snakes look like a Northwest on steroids. Usually sporting some darker colorations, they spend a lot of their time sitting in ambush, hunting for small mammals, particularly Allen's tree squirrels and other rock squirrels. They also seem to like climbing up into trees, similar to their blacktail cousins, presumably to hunt for these squirrels. Currently, not a lot is known about their full range, since their populations are so isolated and difficult to get to. And while we don't have a lot of information about the bite, there's actually ongoing studies with this snake because apparently their venom contains cytotoxins. Now, cytotoxins are very medically useful. It's actually something that's found in copperhead venom and is used to treat various types of cancer. These are certainly my favorite looking tropicals since they have that face just like a bushmaster, they're super bulky, and they have a lot of scales on their face. They just look like a dragon. I think the tropical rattlesnakes are one of the coolest and most overlooked rattlesnake groups in the world. Most of them I would put into high B or low A tier. But I just love the Tanakans so much. That build is just absolutely insane, and they're one of my favorite tropicals. They're incredibly photogenic, they look like a bushmaster, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing them someday. So they're going into S tier. Looking at the tropical rattlesnakes, they absolutely rule Central and South America, and because of this, they run into a lot of conflicts with people. Unlike our next batch of rattlesnakes, which virtually never get seen. The Oaxacan pygmy rattlesnake, recently described in 2018, inhabits the southern portion of Mexico's montane pine oak habitat, where they're currently listed as a species in decline, and they're actually federally protected in Mexico. They can be distinguished from other Mexican pygmies by the bands on their tail, but overall, they look pretty similar, and they just inhabit a much smaller range. Much like the other LDRs, their venom isn't super toxic since they feed on small mammals, birds, and even insects. But I couldn't find much information on the bite. Their declining status is mostly attributed to agriculture clearings and wildfires in the region, which is pretty interesting to me. A lot of rattlesnakes are fire adapt, and montane habitats typically have a fire element to them, but apparently in these habitats, the wildfires get pretty bad. Even though they live in a very isolated area, it seems like they're quite plentiful in certain regions. And I can only hope that that continues to be the case for these neat little animals. But beyond that, they aren't that different from the Mexican pygmy, so they'll be joining them in B tier. Our next rattlesnake species lives in a very unique region of Mexico, the Trans-Mexico Volcanic Belt, one of the most geographically complex regions in the Western Hemisphere. This volcanic mountain range essentially cuts Mexico in half, running from the Pacific coast all the way to the Atlantic coast. The region is known for its incredible sky island habitats that are actually built on volcanic terrain. And where you have sky islands, you'll probably have some kind of little LDR. The cross-banded mountain rattlesnake is an extremely rare rattlesnake that calls this volcanic region home. Growing no larger than 1.5 feet, they have a lot of similarities with the twin-spotted rattlesnake. It's a really cool endemic LDR species that only exists because of this geographic isolation. But beyond that, we don't know too much about them. But like I said, they're incredibly rare, they live on volcanoes, and they're very similar to the twin-spotted, so they're going into B tier. Our next rattlesnake was only just described in 2014. The Campbell's rattlesnake is another montane LDR that inhabits the northern portion of the Sierra Madre del Sur mountains. And while they are geographically separated from other dusky rattlesnakes, and the common name doesn't reflect this, these are essentially just another rarer dusky rattlesnake. We still have a lot to learn about their overall ecology, lifestyle, venom, but from the looks of it, a lot of those traits are going to be pretty similar to your other dusky and rock rattlesnakes. So he's getting the same tier as them, C tier. And at the end of this very rare rattlesnake list, we have Tlaloc's rattlesnake. Rather than being a sky island specialist, these LDRs mostly live in cloud forest habitat, actually living in lower elevations than its close cousins, and usually have a bit of a different shape and eye marking. They're named after the Aztec god of rain, which to me makes a lot of sense as they're inhabiting a more rainy, humid environment. We're still learning more about these rattlesnakes every year, and they're a very understudied species. But unfortunately, they don't have any outstanding features, so I'm putting them into C tier. So far, we've covered rattlesnakes across mountains, dry sandy deserts, and dense tropical regions. But now it's time for a group of rattlesnakes that inhabits a very unique habitat. Let's take a look at the island dwellers. Island biogeography is one of my favorite topics because being isolated often comes along with really bizarre adaptations. Whether it's due to harsh or unique island habitat, or populations of animals are so small that there's a lot of inbreeding and genetic mutations. These are factors to consider when looking at any island wildlife. And for our rattlesnakes, it means a whole stack of new species. The San Esteban rattlesnake is an island variant of the Blacktail rattlesnake that actually ended up being a whole new species. Described in 1999, they're a medium-sized rattlesnake, pretty similar to their mainland counterparts, that thrives in xeric rocky hillsides found on their small island home. Unlike many island rattlesnakes we're going to be discussing, there's actually very little human impacts on the population, meaning they're doing pretty well for themselves despite being in such an isolated location. Their slender build allows them to climb up trees, hunting for endemic mammals and many different island birds. And since there aren't huge mammalian predators on the island, they actually have what's called a reduced rattle. Likewise, on another island in the Gulf of California, the San Lorenzo Island rattlesnake also has very similar traits to the San Esteban. A really thin body, very mild colors, and a reduced rattle. But instead of being an island blacktail variant, these guys are a variant of the red rattlesnake. Oftentimes, since these islands have so few resources, and it's very hard for rattlesnakes to get there, it's first come, first served. There's usually only room for one full-sized island rattlesnake. And this is a perfect example of that. Unlike their mainland counterparts, San Lorenzos are actually pretty adept at climbing trees, likely for the same reasons as the Estebans, hunting birds and small lizards. These two island rattlesnakes, while a great example of island biogeography, just aren't that unique when compared to their mainland counterparts, and they most certainly aren't the coolest island rattlesnakes. So they're going into C tier. Of all the species that we've covered today, there's one group in particular that would be really adept at living on islands. They match the rocks that they live on, so it only makes sense that the speckled rattlesnake would have island variants. The Louse Island and Horsehead Island speckled rattlesnakes showcase this perfectly, living on tiny island habitats that most other rattlesnake species wouldn't stand to live on. Both only described in 2018, not only are they perfectly camouflaged for their respective island habitats, but they exhibit a trait known as island dwarfism. Whether it was due to limited resources, smaller rock crevices, or predation by island birds, these two speckled rattlesnakes are incredibly small when compared to their mainland counterparts, growing only to about 2 feet in length. And their overall build seems to be a bit more stocky and dwarf-like. Both are currently threatened by invasive species and inbreeding as major causes of decline. And since the islands they're endemic to are so small, without a little bit of conservation awareness, it's very likely that these rattlesnakes will be wiped out. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have a rattlesnake with the longest name today, the Angel de la Guarda Island Speckled Rattlesnake, otherwise known as the Archangel Island Speckled Rattlesnake. These island beasts grow up to be 4.5 feet in length, which is actually larger than their mainland counterpart. Now that might not make much sense at first, until you look at their habitat and their competition. These snakes inhabit the beaches of their native island, living along rugged seashores where they hunt for just about anything smaller than them. Lizards, mammals, birds, you name it. Since their island is a lot larger than louse and horsehead specks, food and habitat isn't really the issue, but they do have an extra predator to compete with. King snakes also live on the very same island, and they eat rattlesnakes. Being larger than your potential predator, or eating larger prey than them, is a lot better than being a smaller animal, which leads to gigantism. Island biogeography, it's just awesome. I love all three of these species. They're really unique, and they showcase a really unique biological concept that many people don't know much about. And personally, the Archangel Island species is one of my favorite looking specs. These snakes are certainly at the top of A tier, but they're certainly not my all-time favorite island rattlesnake. And before we move on, a few honorable mentions to the island rattlesnakes that haven't been classified as their own snake. The Corando Island rattlesnake is actually an island variant of the western rattlesnake, so that's our final western subspecies. Isla Tortuga rattlesnakes are just a smaller western diamondback variant. They're really just an island diamondback. They're very skinny little dudes. El Muerto and Coralvo Island specks, while they do match their island rocks, aren't so different from their mainland relative. Cedros Island rattlesnakes, another red rattlesnake subspecies, are actually one of my favorites. Personally, I think it's a full species, but hey, what do I know? I just work with American rattlesnakes. If they ever do get described though, I just want to say, I called it. And the Marijoan Island rattlesnake, a neotropical islander that I could not even find a picture. There is not a single public picture of one of these snakes anywhere online. Apparently they don't look too different from the neotropicals down there, but I couldn't tell you. Can't find a picture of one anywhere. However, I have priced the flight and the boat trip, so if anyone wants to fund that, just hit me up. And with that, we are moving back to the mainland to look at the most bizarre, rarest, and most unique rattlesnakes in the world. The next three rattlesnakes are my all-time favorite Mexican species, and it's not even close. The long-tail rattlesnakes are an incredibly unique looking and elusive complex made up of 3 species. Named for their long, slender tails that make up 15% of their body length, these snakes have an incredibly small and quiet rattle. Overall, very little is known about these animals' lifestyle. We believe they mostly inhabit dry oak forests and tropical forests, but where they're most often seen by people is actually in cannabis and poppy fields, right smack dab in the most dangerous regions in western Mexico. Because of this, any bites that happen from longtails usually go undocumented. And these same illegal activities oftentimes means These animals end up in the black market where they're sold as exotic pets, which is actually where our only bite data comes from, as people illegally buying endangered rattlesnake species typically aren't the most risk-adverse crowd. Now I say endangered, but only one, the Sinaloan longtail, is actually officially listed as vulnerable. These are probably the most observed of the longtails, although they still are incredibly rare. Found south of Sinaloa in the Sierra Madre Occidental Mountains in very isolated populations, their patterning and colors are a mix between a tropical and a Massasauga, sometimes having these bright orange and greens, but a lot of times there'll be a more mute sage coloration. In contrast, the Hamontland longtails, or the Outland rattlesnake, is found further south in the Sierra Madre del Sur Mountains, and was actually rediscovered back in 2008 after not being seen for decades, which just goes to show how isolated and rare these snakes really are. And further down the Pacific coast, last but not least, is the Guerreran longtail, and was actually discovered whenever the Outlands was rediscovered in 2008. Both of these species are actually listed as data deficient, meaning we don't even have enough information to label them as not concerned or an endangered species. But with constant pressure coming in from agriculture and poaching, I think we know which it's likely to be. To me, and this is my not so educated opinion, so please bear that in mind, the longtails almost seem like this new third category of rattlesnake. They don't seem like your typical full-size crotalus, and they don't seem like the smaller Massasaugas, the Cisturas. To me, they're almost like a pygmy tropical rattlesnake. That's kind of the best way that I can describe the longtails. Very unique head structure. They are just their own little thing in western Mexico. Their unique appearance, elusive nature, and their crazy isolated habitats make them a top-tier rattlesnake in my book, and they're actually one of my favorite looking rattlesnakes, and for that reason, they're going straight into S tier. I am probably somewhat biased though, y'all have to let me know what you think about them. And speaking of rattlesnakes threatened by cartel activity, cartel, please don't kill me, I just look at rattlesnakes. We have the Tanzataran dusky rattlesnake. By far the rarest of the duskies, these LDRs have to put up with constant poaching, and most notably, active volcanic eruptions, which, sort of happens when your only habitat tends to be the slopes of a volcano. They're actually only one of 2 internationally protected rattlesnake species, and there's even a captive breeding program for these guys. Overall, they might not look like much, but they're an incredibly rare snake living across an active volcano, so they do get a slight bump up from their relatives. They'll sit in B tier. And the most recent rattlesnake to our list, the Guerreran pygmy rattlesnake, is another insanely rare montane Mexican pygmy that has less than 10 public observations that I could find. I actually do have some friends that went to see some a few years back, and they got to give me some details about the habitat and the snake. They don't look like all too much compared to the other Mexican pygmies, but the habitat is absolutely gorgeous, and it's a really cool snake if you really want to see all of the rarest rattlesnakes that Mexico has to offer. They are pretty similar to the other LDRs, the other montane species, and we don't know that much about them. As I said, they've only recently been discovered, but to me it looks like they have a little bit of a bulkier head compared to their relatives, so maybe they have a different venom type. Still, unless more information comes out about these guys in the next few years, I would stick them in the same category with their other pygmy relatives. As you can see, covering the data-deficient rattlesnake species is a pretty hard thing to do, and it's a very limited topic. These animals live in some of the most remote and inaccessible parts of the world. Now, sometimes what happens is a biologist will discover and describe a species, and then nobody else finds or even sees it. This leads to arguments and discussions about whether it even exists at all. And this next rattlesnake species is one of those cases. The Yucatan rattlesnake is one that most people, even many rattlesnake researchers, don't know actually exists. Found in a very small portion of Venezuela, these rare tropical rattlesnakes are much smaller than their close relatives, and have more of a speckled patterning. Their venom is pretty toxic overall, but since they have such a small venom yield, I don't think there's been any recorded deaths or even many bites. But I didn't actually find any evidence of any fatalities from their bites. They're listed as a data-deficient species, so they're likely receiving a lot of pressure from black market sales, so the only places you'll ever see these animals is in zoos or exotic collections. Quite honestly, I had trouble finding any photos of these guys in the wild, let alone video. Their discovery, rediscovery, and re-rediscovery, though, is quite entertaining to me. Every time someone went and found one of these animals, they would come back with not enough information, and the next guy would go, nah. And this went on for decades. We eventually had enough data to finally agree that these are in fact a species that exists. So let this be a lesson. If you're ever out exploring crazy isolated habitats where you could in fact find a new species, make sure to document it. Make sure to take photos, videos, write it down, collect DNA, just do whatever you got to do. Make sure that people actually have evidence that it's a new species. I think these little tropicals are really cool, and honestly, I would love to see them in the wild someday. I think they're at the very least an A-tier rattlesnake, but I'm going to argue that they're at the bottom of S-tier. Super cool colors, they're rare, and they have a really toxic venom. And finally, we are down to our 3 rarest rattlesnake species. These are the most bizarre, most extreme rattlesnake. Their existence pushes the boundary of what a rattlesnake is, and their continued survival is certainly not guaranteed. But before we get to those snakes, we have one more insane phenomenon to discuss: hybridized rattlesnakes. A species is often considered any group of animals that's able to successfully reproduce with its own kind and produce a viable offspring. But some species are similar enough in build and genetics that they can hybridize. While there's no evidence that rattlesnakes are capable of mixing with non-rattlesnakes, contrary to popular belief, there are crazy rare instances we see mixed rattlesnakes. Mojave and prairie rattlesnake hybrids are probably the most common of these. Living in similar habitats in the southwest US, these snakes interact with each other quite a bit, and they have a lot of similar characteristics. The hybrids aren't super distinct though, so they usually end up being called one or the other species without the person knowing that they're actually looking at a hybrid. The Quaternion dusky and rock rattlesnake mixes are some of the hardest snakes to identify, which I won't get too much into right now. But what's unique about them is the hybrid actually creates a different venom type that neither species has on its own. This is a super new field of science, and it opens up so many doors when it comes to research, medicine, and an understanding about how these different venom types interact and come to be. And finally, the tankiest hybrid rattlesnake, an abomination capable of growing to be the largest unnatural rattlesnake in the world. The batwing rattlesnake is a hybrid between the eastern diamondback and the timber rattlesnake. Named for its odd patterning, the batwing is often bred in captivity, producing these monstrous snakes that showcase hybrid vigor, which basically means their offspring grows faster and stronger than each individual species. Despite me saying that they're unnatural, these guys do in fact, although rarely, appear in nature. They've been found in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Alabama quite a few times already. And I actually followed up on a lead in Mississippi of one a few years back, but I came up short as they are, in fact, incredibly rare. We do think that most of these hybrids are sterile, but it really depends on how similar the two species that mix are. But honestly, who truly knows at this point? Biology is the study of exception, and the persistence and tenacity of the rattlesnake is one of the biggest exceptions of all, especially in the modern world where people's best efforts are usually to destroy them. Speaking of which, we are back to our 3 rarest rattlesnakes that could potentially lay claim to the rarest rattlesnake in the world. And while that can be hard to determine, we are going to give it a go. The Aruba Island rattlesnake is a tropical island rattlesnake species found only in the Caribbean off the coast of Venezuela, where it's often considered to be the rarest rattlesnake in the world, with a little over 200 individuals remaining in the wild. Despite many conservation organizations labeling them as critically endangered, they actually have 0 legal protections outside of the national parks, and besides a captive breeding program that was recently started for these animals. They're pretty similar in size and venom potency to their mainland counterparts, but they have a very faded coloration, and like many island rattlesnakes, they like to climb and hunt for birds a lot. Being from the Caribbean, they face a lot of threats from people. But what's even wilder than that is the thing that's pushing them closer and closer to extinction is the invasive boa species that are actually outcompeting them on their island, as well as the constant harassment from other invasive species. Their habitat is also one of the harsher island habitat, since they have to survive dry, thorny acacia scrub that at any time can be hit by a cataclysmic tropical storm. Honestly, I don't know how there's any vipers left in the Caribbean, let alone a rattlesnake of this size. The island hasn't been directly hit by a hurricane in about 2 decades, but even still, it only takes one bad hurricane to mess them up, so I'm honestly surprised that they've made it this far. These snakes are up there as some of the most extreme rattlesnake species, and to me, that puts them right at the top of A tier. And speaking of extreme, we have another volcano dweller, the Tansatero cross-banded rattlesnake. This snake is so data deficient, it is not even funny. I found virtually nothing on these animals. Everything that we know about these guys is mostly inferred from other LDRs and the other cross-banded rattlesnake. But as their habitat would suggest, they have a much darker coloration, which helps them camouflage on those volcanic slopes. We don't know what's happening with these snakes, but I did find a singular police report of a cartel bust where a bunch of these snakes had been poached and they were going to attempt to sell them on the black market. But granted, this was a few years back, and I have subsequently lost the police report, so this is all alleged. So, allegedly, poaching is a problem for these guys as well. I would love to put them higher up on the list, but being as there's so little information on these animals, I'm going to put them with the other cross-bandeds in B tier. And finally, we have the Santa Catalina Island rattlesnake. This rattlesnake has no rattle. That's right, a rattleless rattlesnake. So you might be asking yourself, if this snake doesn't have a rattle, then what makes it a rattlesnake? And the answer is, it just is a rattlesnake. Similar to the San Lorenzo and the San Esteban rattlesnake, the Santa Catalina Island rattlesnake Rattle continues to be reduced due to a lack of large mammalian predators on its island. And eventually, it lost its rattle entirely, leaving a small, strange nub where there was once a rattle. They also have more elongated bodies and extra long fangs. And typically, they don't let go of their prey when they bite. Once again, another adaptation for hunting birds. They're probably the most adept bird hunter of the island rattlesnakes. They also like to hunt for the endemic mouse species that only lives on the very same island. This is the other rattlesnake that's listed as critically endangered globally, mostly due to invasive species like cats and consistent pressure from people. As you can imagine, a rattleless rattlesnake would sell for a lot of money on the black market. Despite living in such a harsh environment, these snakes are actually incredibly delicate compared to other snakes. While I think a rattleless rattlesnake is absolutely bizarre, rattles are the absolute staple of this group, and it's a courtesy that all of the other species up until now have given us. They will give us that warning rattle. These rattlesnakes just come along and mess that up. But they're super unique for it, so I would say that they belong in S tier. Of these three rattlesnake species, the absolute rarest rattlesnake is difficult to determine, but based on current information, it is in fact the Aruba Island rattlesnake. But the Tansatero cross-banded is definitely the least observed rattlesnake of the bunch, since you're a lot less likely to see the same individuals in that volcanic habitat, whereas the Aruba Island rattlesnakes, we're often going to be seeing the same ones. But in all three cases, there are not many of these rattlesnakes left in the world. Which leads me to the ultimate question. How many rattlesnakes are there actually? Today, we have discussed 58 species and 90 subspecies, with complexes being split up or combined for the sake of this video. But there are likely, or I'd like to say, definitely more rattlesnakes to be discovered. And I'd like to bring up a rattlesnake that I saw personally a few years back in Roy Engeldorf's collection. A purplish Mexican LDR of some kind, with a crazy hot temperament. I've still never seen a rattlesnake like it, and after doing further research, it's really hard for me to say if it's a new species or an unknown Tamaulipan hybrid of some kind. It was kicked around by a few people and they wanted to name it after him, Engeldorfi, but his nickname, the same that I give to the Tamaulipan rocks, the variable rattlesnake, is a lot more fitting. But not only does Mexico still have rattlesnake secrets to explore, but all of Central America and South America too. The neotropical subspecies that we discussed are likely to be elevated to full species within my lifetime, especially the Marahoan, given information or at the very least pictures come to light. And keep in mind, for the longest time we thought all of the rattlesnakes from Central and South America were just one species. But we now know that it's at least 6 different species, and they all have totally different lifestyles and venom. And if that weren't enough, over the course of making this video, I've found 3 distinct areas, hundreds of square miles of habitat, grasslands, deciduous rainforests, and these places are likely to have new rattlesnake species. And they're right smack dab in the middle of, well, I don't think I'm going to be sharing that information just yet. We're just going to have to get down there and see for ourselves one day. Even with all of our increases in technology and fieldwork, rattlesnakes continue to surprise us every single day. New species are still being described, venoms still go untested, And in the shadowy corners of their range, caves, volcanoes, untracked canyons, there are still so many stories waiting to be told about the incredible rattlesnake. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys next time.